was first indicated.
Margaret, I just want to start first with the CNHE's opening statement and some of the facts that have been presented in the CNHE's special chapter and in his opening statement. So on the non-ETS targets, it says on the basis of projections, Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions for the period 2008 to 2012 exceed the level committed to under the Kyoto Protocol. That didn't happen. Isn't that the case? It did happen, but it was as a consequence of, I read it on, ultimately Ireland met its emissions target for that period, but mainly due to the contraction in economic activity. In other words,
yes,
the crash saved our bacon and saved our blushes. Would that be?
That is an interpretation you could put on it.
That could be seen as fair.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there was activity designed to reduce emissions, but I think it's accepted that the bulk of the decline in emissions was due to cutbacks in economic activity.
Okay. And then when you look at energy targets in terms of renewable energy, there was a mandatory target for at least 16% of gross final energy consumption to come from renewable sources. We haven't, or we're not going to meet that target. Is that correct?
That's the projection.
That's the projection, and that will cost the state 110 million. And again, why is that? Just remind us how it will cost us 110 million.
Well, there is an obligation, and I think the representative of the department has just mentioned it, about purchasing of statistical transfers. And that is currently the estimated.
It's a target we're not going to meet anyway, and it's going to cost us money.
Yeah, it's really, I think the expectation at this stage is by how much the shortfall will be, and then what will be the price of the statistical transfers.
We'll figure that out in 2020, and then the 20% energy efficiency by 2020. It looks like we're not going to achieve that target either. It'll be in the region of 16%. So they're the figures in your report, and I suppose the global figures under the Paris Accord and the targets we have to meet by 2030. We had other departments in other organisations in as well. It seems we're not going to meet those targets either. So we're not really in a good place in terms of reaching targets that we either set for ourselves or targets that we sign up to, Mr. Carroll. Would that be a fair comment to make?
We'll come in first on the 2030 target, and I think I mentioned in my opening statement the projections in the CNHE's chapter in relation to 2030 are based on EPA analysis, which hadn't incorporated the measures included in the Climate Action Plan, which was published earlier this year. Now, when we were putting the Climate Action Plan together, it's based on analysis to bring forward the sort of most cost-effective measures to ensure that we do meet our 2030
Okay, but before
target.
we get into that, because obviously, yes, there is a new climate action in place, climate action plan, but before that plan came into being, the reality is, as the facts have been presented by the CNHE and all of the targets that were set out in his report, the state is failing to meet them. And unless there is drastic changes that occur as a consequence of implementing the climate action plan, and we don't know what that will mean, the assumption certainly from the organisations which were before us is that it's unlikely that we're going to reach the targets that we set ourselves for 2030. And can I just say, one of the problems I have with this is when you push something out for that length of time, and I said this to the ESRI and the CSO when they were here, if you have a target that's for 2030, so when you come in here today in 2019, or if you come in 2020 or 2021, you can always say, well, what we'll do down the road might get us to 2030. But you will be gone, possibly, from your position. Maybe there might be somebody else sitting there, and most likely we'll be telling people sitting in my seat, if I'm still here or somebody else is here, that we haven't reached our targets. The problem here is that we don't have short-term, medium-term, and we have long-term targets, but we don't have short and medium-term targets that we can actually assess properly what's been achieved and not been achieved.
Again, if I could comment on that. The Climate Action Plan envisages the bringing forward of new climate legislation to provide for carbon budgets on a sectoral basis. The first carbon budgets are to be in place from 2021 to 25, 26 to 30, and 31 to 35. There'll be a role for the Climate Change Advisory Council on advising government on an economy-wide basis what those 5-year carbon budgets should be It'll then be the responsibility of the Minister to recommend to Government and the Oireachtas the acceptance of those budgets and the division of them on a sectoral basis. And they will provide annual ceilings that sectors will have to remain under in order to meet the climate obligations.
But Mr. Carroll, that may or may not be the case. Okay, what we do with the Public Accounts Committee is a look back on the previous 1 year, 2 years, 3 years and 5 years. And what we can do here today is benchmark your department and the state against targets that they set themselves 5 years ago and 10 years ago or 2 years ago. And leaving aside what might happen in the future, I accept that there is a new climate action plan. I accept that there will be more scrutiny, I suppose, and more targets set for each line department. And I sit on the committee which will be responsible for scrutinising the department, so that is a step forward. But in terms of what has gone before us, is it fair to say that we have been poor, or at least we have been in a position where we haven't reached our targets that we either set ourselves or were set for us as part of overall agreements?
I suppose if you go through the targets, it is as the CNAG reported. There will be a shortfall in terms of our emissions target to 2020. We're expected to reduce our emissions by 5 to 6% relative to the target set. In terms of renewable energy, again, as reported by the CNAG, we had a 16% target for renewable energy. We're going to hit 13% on that. If you break it down, that was broken down as a 40% target for renewable electricity. We've made very, very strong progress on renewable electricity and may get close to the 40%. On transport, it was a 10% target. We're predicting we'll hit 9 out of the 10. And the area that is most problematic is the renewable heat component of the target. And our dispersed settlement pattern and the associated challenges with that is probably the reason why we're finding it more difficult on the renewable heat target. But there are ambitious targets in the Climate Action Plan to retrofit 500,000 houses by 2030 and to install 400,000 heat pumps, which is a technology that is suitable for dispersed settlement patterns and in shifting them towards renewable heat.
Okay, and I wish you well in all of the work that you do. We all want to make sure that we reach our targets, and we're all focused on making sure that climate action means action and that we reach the targets that we set. But we have to be honest and say up to now we have not. And up to now, in a lot of areas, we're lagging behind. And by the way, when you talk about retrofit, the Taoiseach is at some conference, international conference, and he spoke today about a €50 billion retrofit. That's how much it would cost to retrofit every home in the country. Is it possible to retrofit every home in the country?
That's what we need to do by 2050. And I think the figure that Taoiseach was quoting was an investment figure out to 2050 based on today's
But isn't that my point?
Costs.
It's easy to throw those figures out there and say we'll do something by 2050. In reality, let's bring us back down now to planet Earth. Are we going to be in a position in 2050 that we'll have spent €50 billion on retrofitting homes? Because this is the thing then that drives people spare, because people want to engage, they want to be able to make the changes. For people whose homes are heated by oil or gas, they're listening to this, and they're the ones, I'm going to get to the carbon tax in a second, that are subject to carbon tax increases. But when you push figures out 2050, we'll have €50 billion spent on deep retrofit or retrofitting people's homes. Is that really a credible objective for the state to set itself, in the sense that can it be met? And if it can be met, where's the money going to come from to pay for it? Is it going to be on the households? Is it going to is it that the state has to borrow, or is it that the homeowners have to borrow? Because I can't see the Exchequer coming up, and I might be wrong, but I don't see €50 billion being spent by the state on retrofitting homes by 2050. Now, maybe I'm wrong, and you might be able to correct me on that.
I think there's a couple of comments that can be made on that. The €50 billion is based on today's costs, the total investment required, not distinguishing between what the state might contribute and what the private sector might contribute. So I think that's the first important distinction to make. The second is that, again, in the Climate Action Plan, there's a new model of retrofitting to be brought forward, where we're seeking to aggregate groups of houses and through aggregation achieve economies of scale. The expectation would be that over time the costs of retrofitting houses will fall. So they're probably two.
But the most recent retrofit programme that the department rolled out ended up in controversy because, as you know, there were people who applied, I think, past the deadline, and then there was, or they had been not, I suppose, discouraged for making an application, I think was the issue. So they applied, and many then did not get it. But what was the average amount of money that householders in that particular scheme would have had to contribute to benefit from that deep retrofit? On average, what would it have been?
If I may, Deputy...
Just give me the average figure.
Typically, the grant rate from SEI would be at around about 35 to 40%.
And what would the householder have had to come up with in terms of capital?
Again, those you could be talking a couple of €1,000. Would depend.
Well, more than a couple. So define a couple. It was definitely wasn't one or two anyway. That's for sure.
Yeah. So
it was much higher than that, wasn't it?
It would.
Would it be more than 10 on average?
I'd have to.
I think it was because we had them in here. So my point is, how many people do we represent have that kind of money to spend on deep retrofit? So if we're making schemes available to deep retrofit homes, let's not do it for the people with the deepest pockets, who can afford to deep retrofit and then have all of the benefits that come from energy efficiency. When carbon taxes go up, they benefit. But the vast majority of people who don't have the money, don't get any state supports to actually enable them to retrofit, are the ones that actually lose out. So I'm going to come to the carbon tax if I can. And the CNHE rightly said it was 431 million the Exchequer collected in 2018. It's 3.35 billion was collected since the carbon tax was introduced. So if you can, Mr Carroll, tell me what that €3.35 billion was spent on.
The carbon tax that was collected to date went into the general base of Exchequer expenditure, and I'm not in a position in terms of carbon tax receipts to date to explain where that money was spent. What I can say is that in terms of increases in the carbon tax expenditure, and the first was in the budget of this year, it was a €6 increase, that the money generated by that increase is very clearly ring-fenced for climate action activity. The figure was, I think, 90 million in total for next year, and that is broken down in terms of protecting the vulnerable, 21 million towards the fuel allowance, energy poverty, efficiency upgrades 13, the just transition 20 million for the Midlands to retrofit social housing, 5 million for peatlands rehabilitation, 6 million for the just transition fund, and then there's other allocations for greenways, urban cycling 9 million, electric vehicles 8 million, further investment in EV charging infrastructure 3 million, the Green Climate Fund for Overseas Development Aid 2, and Green Agricultural Pilots 3. So the 90 million that's coming from the €6 increase is fully accounted for in terms of climate mitigation expenditure. Prior to the increase this year, receipts went into general revenue receipts and formed part of the general expenditure base. And
I accept that you have a job to do. You're coming here and giving us what is the government line and the department line. Here's the reality. The money is still going into general government expenditure. There is no hypothecating of any money. There is no ring fencing. So you can give us a whole load of line items that might be in any particular budget and say, well, that's because we increased the carbon tax. But the headline figure of €3.35 billion was raised from households, from businesses, from working families in terms of carbon taxes since 2010. And the Department of Communications and the Department of Finance, who are here, are unable to tell us what that money was spent on. What we do know is that last year, carbon emissions did not go down. They went slightly up. Is that correct? What was it?
Slightly down.
Slightly down, but very slightly. And I think agriculture was up, and there was another area that was up as well, but very slightly down. So we've taken €3.3 billion out of people's pockets. It's gone into general government expenditure. It wasn't spent on enabling people to make a transition to reduce their carbon footprint. You're now telling us that will happen with only the surplus of what the increase would be, only the increase, not the overall. So how much will come in, what's projected to come in 2020 on carbon taxes overall? Not just the increase, but the overall.
Well, 90 million.
That's the increase. I'm talking about the overall.
I don't have the figure for the overall.
The full year, from memory, Deputy, I think the full year revenue from the carbon tax at the rate of €20 a tonne, which is the existing rate, would have been in the region of 200 million. So again, you add on the €6 increase, it's just under 300 million for.
Well, in 2018, if we took in 431 million.
Beg your pardon. Beg your pardon.
Sorry. Yes. So what would the? So it wouldn't be 200.
The reason you're here. I find it extraordinary. You're the lead department when it comes to climate change, and you don't even know how much money is being collected in carbon tax. That's the reason you're here. If we thought after the previous two meetings we would have had this information and where it is used. We understand the future, but people keep telling us the PAC is, the sectoral committees and other committees will be looking at the future plan. But
I would imagine that the figure would be over 500 million euro.
520.
Would be 520. I would imagine that will be the figure. So if it isn't, and maybe the CNHE might have the figure.
I'm looking at the statement in the budget briefing. The increase of €6 per tonne will be applied to petrol and auto diesel from midnight on the 8th of October and all other fuels on the 1st of May 2020. So presumably whatever is generated in 2020 is not the full impact of it.
Yeah.
So that could explain at least some of the
No, but I'm saying that if we
figures.
took in 431 million in 2018 and given, even if it's not a full year increase, it's probably going to be close to 500 million or close to it. So it's certainly 460, 470 plus.
Yeah.
My point is, and if I can just make this point, why isn't that entire amount of money then ring-fenced, as you put it, for climate action measures? If it's so urgent, if you're telling us there's a climate action plan, you're telling us that we're going to get better at reaching our targets, and all you've done is tell us that there's 70 million euro ring-fenced, and I'm going to get to some of that money that was ring-fenced. I want to get to the Midlands issue, because we had the trade unions in before us at the Communications Committee or the Climate Action Committee recently, quite critical of the government and Bord na Móna and ESB's response to just transition. But why isn't the entire take for next year ring-fenced? If climate action is so important, which it is, why only the increase?
I mean, that's a policy decision to date. Climate or carbon tax has gone into general tax revenue receipt and has formed part of.
With all of the challenges, Mr. Carr, 70 million euro, you're talking about just transition, you're talking about, you have the Taoiseach over at an international conference talking about deep retrofitting by 2050 is going to cost 50 billion. We have major problems with public transport in rural Ireland, in all of the regional cities outside of Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Waterford, Galway, rural towns and villages, some of whom have no public transport. And the department is telling us they will ring fence 70 million euro. Whoop-de-doo, 70 million euro on, of the carbon tax that will be ring fenced for climate action measures. Would you see that as a woefully unambitious target for the department to set itself?
In terms of money allocated for 2020, that there is a lot more than the sort of 90 million. I mean, I was just trying to explain where the incremental piece of carbon tax was going. And I know you're very focused on the 431 million that was received, but in terms of like a breakdown of expenditure for next year, have you the figure for the entire?
But then, Mr. Carroll, you could tell us that the 500 million euro, if that's what it is, you could just take line items that are in any of the department spend that you could in any way envisage was green related and say, well, listen, we're ring fencing the entire 500 million. I'm just saying it's a nonsense to come in here and say we're ring fencing money. In reality, you are not. Yes, there are investments which are being made, but you're increasing the carbon tax on households. A lot of those households don't have the ability to make the changes that they need to make, that they want to make. And rather than enabling them to be able to make the changes, what the department and what the government has done is increase the carbon tax this year, and they say they'll increase it for the next number of years, while at the same time having a very unambitious plan on actually providing people with the alternatives that will allow them to make the behavioural changes they need to make.
The government has committed that all increases in carbon tax will be allocated to climate action, and I think the figure on budget day, the estimate was that over the period to 2030 that would amount to an additional €5 billion. I mean, that's a very significant increase in expenditure over and above what's in the National Development Plan in the period out to 2030. And I'll come back to carbon tax. Just one point I wanted to come back to you on was just in terms of helping those who are poorer in the transition. We do have a warmer home scheme for people on lower income, and that funds 100% of the retrofit in homes of people who are poor. It's a scheme run by SEAI, and in terms of
but what's warmer homes? Hang on a second here. This is more of the nonsense. Those people you're talking about, their homes are heated by oil or gas. And if you put an increase on their oil or gas, yes, you can put insulation into their homes. That's fine. But they're still using oil and gas. And what you are doing is increasing the cost on them. You're not allowing them to transform their home into one that has an electric heating pump, for example, or some alternative. It's going to take an awful long time for us to get to that position, and yet you're just increasing the carbon tax on them, not just this year, but next year, the year after, and the year after. I do just have a question, though, on the just transition, because I think it is important. We had the trade unions, Mr. Carroll, before us at the Climate Action Committee. Patricia King headed up a delegation from the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, and she was scathing in her criticism of your department, of the government, of Bord na Móna and the ESB. 2 plants were closed. No just transition plan has been put in place. A lot of the workers, she feels, will lose their jobs without any transition being in place. Bord na Móna has refused even to engage with the unions. They've refused to engage with the Just Transition Forum that the government says is going to be put in place. An announcement was made prematurely to close the 2 plants in question, the ESB plants. 3 government ministers scrambled down to the Midlands to talk to the workers. But you talked earlier about the 70 million that will come from the carbon tax increase, and that's a full year. So the CNEG may be right, it may not be 70 million next year, but we'll see what the figure is. But you talked about the money for the Midlands that's been made available for retrofitting. There is no retrofit plan in place. They're still looking at the detail of it. They're still trying to work out what that will mean. So you don't have a plan for those workers. We all knew a just transition was necessary. We all knew for years, for a long time, that those plants were going to have to close and that there had to be plans in place. And yet here we are, already prematurely closing some of the plants. And yet we have the trade unions who represent the workers saying that a just transition has been a farce. There's a Just Transition Commissioner that's been appointed that doesn't have any remit in relation to workers. Isn't that correct? None whatsoever. She was quite critical of that as well. So how is it the case, when you have workers potentially losing their jobs, that you have the most senior trade union leader in the country saying that Bord na Móna is refusing to engage with them and is involved in de-unionising the company?
I'll come to the Just Transition just in 1 second. Just to go back to one of the points you made earlier, Deputy, in relation to the fuel poor and the impact of the carbon tax on them. It's important to note that more than 1/3 of the funds raised by the increased carbon tax are devoted to ensuring the least well-off are protected. And this has been done through 2 measures: increasing the fuel allowance by €2 per week and that applies from the 1st of January and means an annual benefit of €56.
But do you not hear, one second, and I know you're trying to give the response. Can you not hear the madness of that response? Because the whole logic from the government's perspective of increasing the carbon tax is to change people's behaviour. And now you're saying what you'll do is you'll just increase the fuel allowance, so they don't use any less fuel, any less carbon. That's the madness of this.
And it'll leave 22% of households who are in receipt of the fuel allowance better off than before the increase in carbon tax. It's not being done in isolation. There are also schemes available which will be rolled out over time and are currently being implemented in terms of the Warmer Home Scheme, where 100% of the retrofitting of houses is funded. You can't do everybody's house at once. So if you raise carbon tax, it's important to make sure the fuel allowance is the mechanism through which it's being done.
But tell me how those low-income households are reducing their consumption. Tell me how they're reducing their carbon footprint, their oil or their gas heating their homes. We had this with the ESRI when they were here. Tell me how they're going to do it. Just that response and I'll leave it at that.
It can be done through retrofitting programmes such as the Warmer Home Scheme, where houses are insulated and where grants are available for inserting alternative heating systems into houses. It takes time to roll out those types of programmes, but they are in existence and they're happening, and there's money being provided to do them.
I'm going to call Deputy Murphy.